So hi there, my name's Joe Brewer and I'm the research director here at The Rules. And today I'm really excited to do a short interview with Martin Kirk, who I will introduce in a moment, who also works at The Rules. And for those of you who have been following our work recently, you'll know that we are currently involved in a campaign that is critical of the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to get at the root issues that look at the underlying causes of poverty and inequality. And one of the things that we have realized while running this campaign and in other campaigns in the past is that the way that we go about this work prompts people to tell us their personal stories about how they relate to the work that's happening in development. And that sometimes those stories are quite powerful. Just at a personal level, they really influence us and they bring us inspiration and insight. So we realized for this campaign that we wanted to highlight some of those stories. And so this video is going to be online accompanying a set of blog posts written by people within the development sector telling their personal stories. And we have right here in our midst a person who has worked extensively in the development sector and then has gone through a process of radicalization or changing from the norms of what people typically do there. And that is our colleague here, Martin. And I think that his story might be enlightening for others. So we're recording this interview. So maybe to get started, Martin, could you just say who you are, what is your role at The Rules, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So I'm Martin Kirk, so I coordinate the strategy for The Rules, and I work closely with Joe and our other colleagues.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think may be helpful for setting some context here for the viewers is if you could tell us, how did you get into work on development and poverty in the first place? What was the initial feeling, the passion, the thing that got you started? What was that like for you when you were younger?
Yes, no, I started doing international development work professionally about 15 years ago, and it was an absolute thrill. I've always wanted to work in this field. It was like a natural place for me to gravitate towards, and I was thrilled when I got my first job in a big NGO, a big international aid agency. And I had an absolute blast, and I look back at that time with a lot of fondness. So it felt like I was doing something that touched my soul, that was in line with the purpose that I feel I have in the world.
That's an interesting thing about the work we do here at The Rules, that we often take this almost contrarian position where we're actively external to the development sector and critical of it. So that might prompt in people's minds this question: if you were so happy working for big NGOs, like Save the Children and Oxfam, what was that process like for you to realize that maybe what you were doing wasn't all rosy and sunshine? And were the first indicators that maybe being involved inside of those organizations and inside the sector itself, that maybe you might be complicit in some problems? What were you noticing there that first made you uncomfortable?
My first discomfort really started to come when I looked at public attitudes and why people believe what they do about poverty and inequality. And it became very apparent relatively quickly when we started to look at the science behind people's attitudes and behaviors that they were locked in by a certain number or a small number of essential stories that are told about global poverty and inequality, particularly by those voices that speak the loudest, the big NGOs, the UN, the World Bank. And the very first one of those stories that started to fall apart for me was the story about charity and the idea that the best response to global poverty, or even the legitimate response to global poverty, is for rich people to give a little bit of money to poor people. And now I know that the big NGOs that's not all they say, but that is one of the essential stories that underpins their corporate proposition to the world. And when I started to question that, I started to go down the rabbit hole, and the other stories started to unravel for me. And that eventually led me out of big NGOs and to set up The Rules.
So what was it specifically about charity that you found so problematic? Maybe could you unpack that a little bit more? Were there specific assumptions or beliefs that contradicted your values or that didn't sit well with you? What were those?
Yes, that's exactly what it was, Joe. It was a sense that charity propagates this idea that there is a moral order into the world, and that poor people need to get more like rich people, and there is a moral equivalence made with virtue being equated with wealth and poverty being equated with a lack of virtue. Now, plenty of people in NGOs absolutely do not believe that. But when we started to deconstruct the language and the imagery and the stories that they were telling, what we found from a range of sources was that is actually exactly the story that they are telling, because they are so hooked on the charity story. And they're hooked on the charity story because they are hooked on the charity business model. And when I started to realize that, the big divergence started to happen. And my own values and my own understanding of how the world worked made it more and more uncomfortable for me to be sitting within that story and being a part of an industry that propagated that story. So over time, I just became more and more uncomfortable, and I found myself swimming more and more against the tide. And eventually, I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to follow those values and the opportunity to help set up the rules. So I was very lucky, but it wasn't a very comfortable process for quite a long time.
No, I imagine it wasn't. This is actually something I think gets at the crux of the other personal stories that will be shared online that accompany this video. Is there are people currently working within the development sector who have similar dissonance between how they feel about the work and the work that they feel they need to do. And so I'm curious if you could share, what was it like for you as you were working within, like, let's take the time when I met you, when you were working at Oxfam, and we started deconstructing the language together. This was about 6 years ago. And then the rules was formed about 3 years ago. So there was this intervening period of several years where you had a growing discomfort, but you were still there. So what was that like for you to be in that place?
It was very exciting because we were asking questions and uncovering realities and truths that I thought would be liberating, because they felt liberating to me. I was like, oh, that's why I've been feeling so uncomfortable. Okay, now I have some empirical, well-documented, pretty uncontroversial kind of scientific evidence to explain to me why I've been feeling uncomfortable. So I felt elated at first. And over time, I started to have these conversations more and more within the sector and within other agencies. And gradually, I started to become aware of the reality of the fact that these huge organizations cannot accept these truths very easily. It's not that the people inside them don't believe them. It's not even that there isn't an intent to move beyond some of these things. It's that these are huge, complex organizations, complex adaptive systems in a way. And they can't just turn on a sixpence. They can't just change their direction like this. But where my discomfort really reached a peak was when I started to see people rejecting the logic and the science because it provided too much of a challenge for them. So I didn't mind that it was going to take a long time. What I minded was that people didn't seem to be willing to rise to the challenge. And it was at that point that I came across colleagues who helped me set up the rules. And so I could breathe a sigh of relief that I could follow my own truths rather than stay locked in a system that I felt profoundly compromised within.
This, I think, gets right at the crux of what's happening now with the Sustainable Development Goals. Because 15 years ago, the Millennium Development Goals were formed, and they've had a profound influence on the trajectory of our planetary scale economic systems and political systems. And here we are doing something of a reset where we are locking ourselves into, or potentially locking ourselves into, a way of conceptualizing economic development for another 15 years. In the current state of the world, I think of my own background in atmospheric science, where if we don't deal with the issues causing global warming in the next 15 years, the consequences will be very dire indeed. So this is a time of rather significant consequences. And so many people are operating within the paradigm that has been established by Sustainable Development Goals. And here we are actively critiquing them, making some of our colleagues uncomfortable. And so I'm wondering, for the young people out there today who are really excited and passionate about changing the world, and they're coming into this moment, and these are some of the things that are happening in this moment, what kind of advice would you give to those people as they uncover their own uncomfortable truths? What would you say to them from your place, where you are on the journey now?
Yeah, I'd say, first of all, don't take changing the world completely on your own shoulders, or even changing your own organizations if you're starting to feel uncomfortable with it. That passion you have is your greatest weapon. So hold on to that. You don't need to agree with everybody all of the time in order to be stepping powerfully in your own journey of uncovering the way the world works. improving your own knowledge around that. So be patient with yourself, be patient with others, and if you do feel uncomfortable in your organizations or in your job or with the big development story, that's a sign of health. That's a good thing. It might feel bad in the moment because that's what social norms do to us. When we start to challenge them and question them, one of their powers is to make us feel personally uncomfortable. So it's just important to make sure that you understand that discomfort in the right way. That it does mean that you might be challenging a social norm, but if you are following your own truth, your own journey of inquiry and exploration with integrity, then that is the most important thing you can be doing. And these feelings of discomfort are passing. So stick with it. Find other people who are having the same sort of questions that you are. Hook up with people of the rules, because there are lots of us around, in and around the circle of the rules who feel the same way. I know that there are lots and lots of other people, an increasing number of people out there in the world who are having that same discomfort. And even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there weren't so many alternative places you could find that you could have these conversations and validate these feelings you have. There are more and more of those places now. So find them, join up with like-minded fellows, and you'll be fine.
So I guess the basic takeaway here is really trust your intuition, seek truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And for those people out there in the world engaged in the struggle with us, realize you're not alone. And in today's world of digital media, as this video is a great example, we can find each other and we can share our stories with each other. And that in itself is part of the solution. So, Martin, thank you so much for taking the time with this interview. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to call you one of my friends, to work with you on this. And thank you for sharing your story, which I hope will embolden others to go further along their own spiritual path of growth and discovery.
Wonderful.
So thank you very much, Martin.